He was an old, wrinkled, little bird of a man, and he looked so terribly ill at ease as he stood there alone, off to one side, near the casket of his brother. A rumpled, brown, pinstripe suit hung on him like clothes on a scarecrow. The sleeves were too long, and the cuffs lay in a heap on his shoes. The suit had seen better days, probably on someone else. The high collar of his starched white shirt was too large for his neck, and his tie was something a clown might wear, too wide, too long, with splashes of green and red and orange. And as I looked at him, I had the feeling that somebody had dressed him and placed him there where he stood, much like a bizarre gift from an in-law is dusted off and placed in the living room just before the giver arrives. And so there he stood, cleaned up, carefully placed, yet somehow terribly out of place. And the moment I walked into the funeral home where my grandfather lay and saw that strange, old little bird of a man, I knew who he was. I had never met him, but I knew. It was Herman, my great uncle Herman. Just be polite to him, my mother had said from the front seat as we were driving in from the airport. All you need do is simply introduce yourself, speak to him for a moment, and that is all. Everyone will understand. But I didn't understand. I didn't understand why the family felt the way it did about Herman. All I knew was that Herman could work miracles, that he was a possessor of a miraculous fluid, a wondrous juice that had the power to heal. At least it could heal warts. Herman could heal warts. My dad told me so himself. It was my dad's favorite story and my favorite story too, but not my mother's favorite story. He's a disgusting little man with filthy habits, my mother said. Well, you see, Uncle Herman chewed tobacco. He's been an embarrassment to the family for years, my mother continued. No one knows what to do with him. Granddad even didn't like to admit that he was his own brother. But my dad was a believer, and so was I, and I was glad when he began to tell the story again. You see, we were driving up to Michigan, your great-uncle Herman, your grandfather, and me, my dad said, while my mother said, "Oh, Judd, please." But my dad just smiled and went on. We were driving up to Michigan. I don't know, I was 11 or 12 at the time, I guess, and Uncle Herman was at the wheel. He noticed I kept playing with a wart on my finger. Suddenly he said, "Hold that finger straight out in front of you, son. Hold it still, real still." And Herman eyed it for a minute, like he was taking aim. And before I knew it, my dad said, what had happened, bullseye. He hit that wart with a shot of tobacco juice, while he was driving, no less. "Now don't you wash that finger for 3 days, son," Herman said. But my dad said he couldn't even move his hand, he was so stunned. But he followed Herman's instructions. And at this point in the story, my dad would always say, and guess what? 3 days later, that wart was gone, a finger clean as a whistle. And my dad laughed, and I would laugh, but not my mother, as we pulled into the parking lot of the funeral. This was my first death. No one I loved had ever died. And I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't feel what I thought I should feel or what I thought somebody was supposed to feel. I didn't feel much of anything at all, and I just couldn't understand it. I just felt empty. So it was good to laugh and hear about Herman and warts and miracles. People had already begun to gather, and when we entered, we were greeted by hands and hugs and faces and soft words and weak smiles from relatives I'd never before seen. And they said how good my grandfather looked. But frankly, I didn't think death looked so good on him, and I was relieved when everyone stopped hugging my shoulders and squeezing my hand and started talking a little louder and even laughing in the corner. corners. It was laughter I wanted to hear. And I wanted to hear all about miracles and healing and warts. And I wanted to talk to the strange little old bird of a man, standing there alone off to one side. But as I walked over to him, I wondered, what could I say? Or would he even know who I was? I introduced myself to him and explained whose son I was, and stumbled over some words like, I'm sorry about grandfather. I mean, your brother. And Herman stared over my shoulder and said that he was sorry too. His voice surprised me. It had a gentleness to it, or maybe just a sadness. There was a dullness to his eyes, and in the silence between us, I began to feel uncomfortable and wish that somebody would come and pull me away. For years, I pictured Herman as something I'm not sure about, but certainly not like this, not lifeless and frail, with eyes that seemed to be looking at nothing. He didn't even seem to be filthy or disgusting, just old and sad. And if he did have a miracle or two up his sleeve, then I figured it couldn't be much of a miracle. Not like the kind I needed right then. And I began to wish I'd never met her. The story was so much better. And I wish my grandfather wasn't laying there dead as a doornail, and that I'd seen him more often, I'd known better. And I wish that somebody would say something or do something. But I took a step back and smiled politely and started to say I'd enjoyed, when suddenly I saw Herman's mouth move. But at first no word came out. It was as if his words were coming from a long way off, and his mouth had heard them coming and had jumped the gun. Then his mouth closed and opened again, with the words coming out this time. You know, I had to retire 2 years ago, he said slowly, softly, almost sweetly. Well, really, it was because of my partner. For 60 years, we painted churches. The inside of churches, I mean, and so we worked most of the time on scaffoldings 30 or 40 feet up in the air. But then my partner just couldn't take the heights anymore, and so I had to give it up. Didn't want to work alone. And I was only 83 years old. As if he had been waiting years to talk to someone. He went on and on talking about his partner and painting and the churches they'd done, and his eyes began to brighten and his mouth began to move faster, trying to keep up with the words now tumbling out. But as Herman talked on and on, I began to understand my mother's disgust. For Herman was chewing tobacco. And as he talked, a small, brown, glistening drop of tobacco would creep out of the corner of his mouth. It clung there for a moment, but then it grew in size until the pull of gravity was too much for it, and it had to let go of its precarious grip and begin a slow, winding journey down through the facial crevices below. The journey ended right at the tip of Herman's chin. And there the drop would hang, growing longer and longer and longer, until at last it fell silently onto the white starched collar below. And just when that suspense ended, another drop appeared at the corner of his mouth and began its long, arduous journey toward chin and collar. And so it continued, drop after drop. Herman didn't seem to be aware of the great drama that was taking place on his face, but I was mesmerized by it, because it was the famous, miraculous juice. And I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Not with disgust, but with wonder and awe, I watched the mouth and chin of that strange, strange little man. I watched with such intensity that for a while I didn't realize that no more words were coming from Herman's mouth. Just as suddenly as Herman had started talking, he stopped talking, and he looked straight at me with eyes now alive and glimmering. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a crumpled old red bandana. And very carefully, he opened it. And at first, I couldn't believe my eyes. I blinked and looked again at what lay nestled in the folds of the red bandana. I guess my mouth dropped open. My eyes probably grew large as saucers as I stood there looking at what Herman had unveiled. And what I didn't believe, just couldn't believe, was there. And what was there was a huge, brilliant diamond. It was my wife's, Herman said. After she died, I put it in my back pocket. Been there ever since. Nearly 30 years now. And I wanted to say something, but nothing would come. And when I did hear a voice, it was not mine or Herman's, but the funeral director's, announcing that it was time for the service to begin. And Herman wrapped the diamond carefully in the red bandana and gently put it into his back pocket and smiled a strange little smile. And I smiled too. Then a hand took Herman's arm and my mother motioned me to come, and people took their chairs and somebody cleared his throat. And some men wearing Masonic aprons came to the front and began to speak on cue. But I didn't hear a word they said because all I could think about was that diamond and that strange little old man. I kept thinking about how he had carried it through all the years, how it had carried him through all the years. His love for her love for him, cradled in a rumpled handkerchief, healing the healer. And somehow I knew it would be all right. I never saw or spoke to Herman again. We belonged to a family that gathered only at funerals. And following my grandfather's funeral, there was not another one until Herman's. Not surprisingly, the family did not choose to gather for that one. But I had desperately wanted to, because years before, I caught a glimpse of something eternal, something of love, maybe even something of God in a strange, old little bird of a man who could heal warts, or maybe not, but who could work the one miracle I needed most, and that was to heal a broken heart and put peace and joy where peace and joy belonged. And in our gospel reading today, we hear Jesus say why he has come. And the words he uses are words from the prophet Isaiah. And what Isaiah said was this: the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to comfort all who mourn. And they shall raise up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. And in using those words, Jesus was saying that he was the anointed one, God's Messiah, the one who was bringing good news to the afflicted and healing and release as well. And who were those who were afflicted and brokenhearted and held captive? And who were those who were bound and who mourned and lived among ruin and devastation? They were the people of Israel at the time of Isaiah and the people of Galilee at the time of Jesus. But I think we are those people as well, because we too know what it means to be afflicted by illness or disease, afflicted too with guilt and fear, anger and bitterness, and broken-hearted. Hearts broken by the death of those we love and the failure of love too, the deep disappointments and hard losses, and captive within ourselves, bound by a past we cannot seem to escape, held captive maybe by our own foolishness and great sin, and perhaps too held captive in jobs or by fear of what tomorrow might bring, held captive in lives we don't know how to change or get out of, and what can lie in ruins, our hopes and dreams, relationships, and more, and what can be devastating are our very own lives. It's not just to the people of Israel or Galilee that these words are addressed, but to you and me. And the good tidings these words proclaim, the good news they speak, is that in the power of God, there is the power to heal and mend, the power to set free and release, the power to repair and build up, the power to raise us up out of all that is wrecked and ruined until at last we hope and live and dream again. It is the very promise of God that God shall send to us His very power and presence to work that miracle of healing and peace and hope. And that's what story after story in Scripture proclaims. Story after story telling us what God once did and what Jesus once did for the people of Israel. But often, the stories of what God once did, what Jesus once did, seem far better than the reality of what God can do now. Sometimes I think it's like my meeting at last, Uncle Herman. Instead of a vibrant worker of miracles and a possessor of wondrous power, I saw a wrinkled, old little bird of a man who seemed to have no power left. And there are days when we wonder if God has become a wrinkled, old man. Days when we wonder if God might have retired years ago and is now worn out and powerless. Wonder if God has any miracles left up His sleeve, because there are days when it seems that God doesn't. At least not the miracles we want. And the stories seem far better than the reality. So what are we to do then? There's only one thing I know to do, and that's keep believing. Keep trusting. Keep looking for God where you least expect to find Him. Look for God where there is frailty and weakness and pain and emptiness, because that is where God is so often found, and how God often comes to us, because that's where we're most ready for God, most open to God, most need God. And maybe it's at those moments there's at last room for God in our lives. And maybe God comes to us in the form of weakness and frailty, because God does not want to overwhelm us or overpower us, but come to in such a way that we can receive Him and know His love. And keep believing, keep looking for Him is the only way I know. And the miracle God will work may not be the miracle we most want, but it will surely be the miracle we most need. The miracle of hope, release, peace down deep inside. Kind of like finding a brilliant diamond in a rumpled handkerchief. It can happen. In the presence of a frail little bird of a man, God's very presence and glory can be found. And I know perhaps all of this sounds rather foolish and ridiculous. But then the truth is, I am a very foolish and ridiculous person. Because I believe that my Uncle Herman really could heal warts. And I believe that God somehow took the form of a little bird of a man one day long ago and healed me in my grief. And I believe that the love of God for us and our love for one another can heal and mend broken hearts and release us unto hope again. And I believe that in God there is the power to repair and build up again what has been wrecked and ruined. And I believe that God comes to us day after day after day in His love and power. And that God does still have a miracle or two up His sleeve. And even if you can't quite swallow the story of Uncle Herman and his wart-healing powers, trust this. At least trust this, that the reality of what God can yet do is a match for all the stories of what God once did. Amen.